Hi, I'm David Bush and welcome back to Bush History. Today I'm going to talk about the Cold War. The Cold War is a huge topic and this is going to be a longer presentation than some, approximately 45-50 minutes by the time I'm finished. The Cold War is it's a tough concept for some people to understand because it's a war of words. It's a war of words and a war of very specific actions. The term Cold War means that hopefully it never turns into a hot war. And it's between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so much of it occurs over what happens at the end of World War II and in a quest for one nation to establish some kind of dominant position in the world over the other nations. So it's a bit of back and forth. What can one nation do? What can another nation do? And it's a war of rhetoric, a war of propaganda, a war of technology, a war of one-upmanship. And it's a war where both nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, are vying for the court of public opinion as to who is doing what is right to get support for their actions. One of the things that's not understood is some of the terminology. We tend to call the Soviets communists in the United States. And that's not true. They're not communists. Communism is an economic state of shared resources where there is no government. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were very specific about that. They believed there'd be a revolution, and during the revolution, the working class would rise up and overthrow management and the aristocrats. And then eventually, the working class would wither away as some kind of government position, in some kind of government position, and the resources of the nation would be shared. Kind of like playing in the sandbox where everybody shares things. It's not realistic. It doesn't work in the world because competition fuels many people. And to compete means you're going to get more than someone else has in some way, shape, or form. So communism doesn't really work. But think about the word communism. Community, communicate. These words are all related. Communism is not a bad idea, and it's not a bad word, and it shouldn't be applied to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a totalitarian dictatorship started by Lenin and Stalin all the way back in 1917. They said that what they were going to do was redistribute the resources, take power away from the aristocrats in Russia, and share the wealth of the new Soviet Union. Unite, that kind of thing. It never got where Lenin envisioned it going. Lenin died very early on in the early 1920s. Stalin took over and really made it a ruthless dictatorship, a totalitarian state in which he was the boss and that was it. Well, one of the funny things about the Cold War is there's a debate is when does it actually begin? Because, as an example, we know the Cold War is going from 1945 to 1991. Those are the years that we traditionally use for the Cold War. 1945, the end of World War II. 1991, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. However, back in 1917, during the Second Russian Revolution, in which Lenin came to power, there was a civil war between the Reds and the Whites in the new, young Soviet Union. And the United States supported the Whites. The Whites supported the Tsar and the aristocrats. So we supported the losing side in the Russian Revolution, which basically meant we supported the side that was trying to overthrow the new, young government of Lenin. So from the very beginning, the Soviets don't trust the United States because we were interfering. We can talk all day whether we should have or not. The fact is we were. President Wilson committed us to this. So nevertheless, the Soviets win, Lenin comes to power, and they already have a distrust towards the United States. We go through the 1920s, we hit the Great Depression, the world falls into this economic calamity. We go into the 1930s, and Stalin turns around and makes a deal with Adolf Hitler called the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact that allows the two of them to carve up Eastern Europe, Well, now the United States distrusts the Soviet Union for being imperialistic in Eastern Europe. So we don't trust them, they don't trust us. And some people call the period from 1917 to 1945 the legacy of distrust. So while in the modern era, we do use 1945 to 1991, it was set up in the 1917 through 1945 period when the two sides are already showing that they don't trust each other. Let's face it, the Soviet Union had no reason to trust us because we interfered in their revolution. And we have no reason to trust Joe Stalin because he makes a deal with Adolf Hitler. So nevertheless, World War II comes together, and when Adolf Hitler turns his back on the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact and attacks the Soviet Union, now we have something in common. We both, the United States and Soviet Union, want to somehow defeat the Nazis. So even though we're very different nations, we have a common goal, and the common goal is to win World War II. So we're brought together with this common enemy. Towards the end of World War II, there's a lot of scheming going on both sides as to what's going to happen after World War II in Europe and which side is going to somehow be dominant in Europe. The United States is going to use money in terms of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. And the Soviet Union is going to leave its troops where they were as they liberated Eastern Europe from the Nazis, and the Iron Curtain is going to form. Then we're going to go into the arms race of the 1940s and 1950s, first atomic bombs, then hydrogen bombs. Then we're going to have coups d'etats around the world, and we're going to have land grabs and a technology race with the space race. Ultimately, what's going to happen in the 1980s, there's going to be an easing of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, between Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan. And we're going to outspend them in the 1980s with SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is commonly known as Star Wars, because the movies were popular at the time. And in 1989, the Berlin Wall will come down, which is the huge symbol for the Cold War. And in 1991, the Soviet Union ultimately dissolves after a coup d'etat against Mikhail Gorbachev that failed. He's reinstalled into power by Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, and at the end of 1991, the Soviet Union ceases to exist as it dissolves into Russia and its neighboring republics, which are now separate countries. And that's pretty much the beginning and the end of the Cold War. Anyway, along the way, there were some very interesting moments between the two nations. And I'm going to take a look at that with you right now in this PowerPoint. I'm going to step outside the camera because I want to show you slide by slide. It's rather long as I go through pretty much year by year or event by event, depending on which is more appropriate. You will see there are years where there's a lot that goes on, and there are years where not much goes on. And that's okay. That's okay. We have an interesting vocabulary I'll share with you along the way, and I've got some pictures of who is actually involved in all of this. So let me cue up this PowerPoint, and I'll be back, but I'll be off camera for most of this. Here we go. Once again, this is bushhistory.net. This PowerPoint will be available on the Bush History website under Topic 22, the Cold War. And there'll be some other information there as well for you to take a look at about the Cold War. So let's move forward now. We have a cartoon to begin things. And if you notice on the left, you see H, Z, and Y bombs. And on the right, you see H, Z, and Y bombs. And you see soldiers. On the left, you see soldiers kind of nondescript. They're supposed to be American soldiers. And on the right, you see soldiers with a sickle and hammer on their helmet. And the sign says, on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. So instead, what they're doing is they're firing bows and arrows. They're using arrows here. And the idea is it's a war of words, but look what we've got to get you if we need to. There was something called mutually assured destruction, which was a term for the day that said, if we attack them, we are mutually assured to be destroyed by them. So there was a war of propaganda going on. So here we go. The beginning begins in 1945 at the end of World War II. We have the death of Franklin Roosevelt. The death of Franklin Roosevelt empowers Joseph Stalin because now he's the big boy here. We have the United Nations. The United Nations Charter is signed on June 26th, and it looks to be an organization dominated by the United States, and many people think it is. On July 17th, we have the Potsdam Conference, and in Potsdam, Joseph Stalin announces there will be no free elections in Europe, and at the same time, we find out that the atomic bomb works. So, ignoring an attempt to surrender by the Japanese, we dropped 2 atomic bombs on August 6th and August 9th to show the Soviet Union what we have. In response, Stalin does not move his troops out of Eastern Europe. And that prompts Winston Churchill to give his famous Iron Curtain speech in March of 1946, in which he says, "An Iron Curtain has come down across Europe as Soviet troops remain in Eastern Europe, and they will remain there until 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union." In 1947, an unofficial announcement of a policy called Containment begins by the Truman government. Basically what it means is that we are going to contain communism wherever it is, and we will do whatever we can to do so. And it starts with something called the Truman Doctrine. In March of 1947, in Greece and Turkey, there are uprisings occurring, and the Soviet Union is threatening to come in and put down those uprisings, and the government of Greece turns around and says, "We don't know what to do about this." And Harry Truman says, "I tell you what, we will offer you $440 million in aid to help rebuild after the war is over and after all the destruction that you've had." And Joseph Stalin says, "Yes, but we will offer you protection. We will bring in our armies and we will protect you." And of course, Greece says, "Protect us from who?" And Greece takes the money, and it begins this idea that the United States will use its huge economic power to build friends in the world. In the end, it ends up over $600 million is used in the Truman Doctrine. And it's thought to be a really good idea. So in June of the same year, Secretary of State George Marshall says, let's take the same idea and apply it to all of Europe. And here, what happens here is we're going to offer economic aid to all of Europe to help them rebuild. It's like dollar diplomacy going all the way back to William Howard Taft. And it ends up being about $13 billion to help Europe rebuild. And we do help Europe rebuild. And of course, whose friend are they going to be then? They're going to be our friends. We do offer the money to the Soviet Union. And Stalin, no surprise to anyone, says, "No, sorry, don't want it." In July of 1947, we get the National Security Act, the NSA. And the NSA becomes this huge government organization that's going to fight the Cold War. Because from it, we get the Department of Defense, we get the National Security Council, which is going to oversee its activities, we get the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and we get the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which are the command of all of the military groups who meet jointly with the President to discuss military preparedness and readiness in times of emergency. 1948, we're going to have the first big test of Cold War strategies. We're going to have the Berlin Blockade. The Soviet Union decides that since Berlin is in its sector, remember, we have a divided Germany here, it's going to stop all traffic in and out of Berlin in terms of rail and roadway and walking. So you can't get into Berlin. And if you control the capital of the country, you essentially control the country. So Harry Truman says, how do I do this? What do I do? And he responds with something called Operation Vittles. Operation Vittles is the largest airlift in history. And what we're going to do is, from June of 1948 until May of 1949, 11 months, we are going to operate an airlift 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, bringing in humanitarian aid to Berlin. And it looks something like this. On the left, you see the divided Berlin, and you see deep inside is much, the part on the right is much larger than the rest of it, but it's all been cut off Because just like there are 4 sectors of Germany, there are 4 sectors of Berlin. It's kind of a strange idea. And on the right, you see what essentially is Operation Vittles, bringing in food, bringing in heating fuel, and bringing in medical aid to the people in Berlin. An interesting sidebar to this, there's something called the candy bomber. When these planes would land, children would meet them as well because they contained food. And one soldier started to give out candy. Well, what that meant was more and more kids were going to show up to get candy, and it was getting dangerous. So he came up with the idea of dropping the candy using handkerchiefs as parachutes. So he started to drop the candy from the planes before the planes landed, so no candy was given out on the runways, and kids would get this candy as it dropped from the sky. So we're talking Hershey bars and different kinds of chocolate bars and things like that. And huge donations rolled in, and pretty soon all of the planes were carrying candy and would drop it for the children. And that was, they were called the candy bombers. Nevertheless, it proved futile because now Stalin is in a position of, well, do I shoot down the planes? And if I shoot down the planes, what I'm shooting down is humanitarian aid, not military aid. And I've started a war by trying to starve people. So Stalin backs down and opens up Berlin again in 1949. Also in 1949, we get NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That is an organization of the allies who border on the North Atlantic. So it's Western Europe, United States, and Canada for the most part. And in September of 1949, President Truman announced the Soviet Union has exploded an atomic bomb, which was a surprise to everybody, because when we exploded the atomic bomb in 1945, Harry Truman was told it would be roughly 8 to 9 years before the Soviet Union could do the same thing. Well, they did it in about half that time. So now there's a sense of urgency because, oh no, the Soviet Union has a bomb too. And what that's going to do is that's going to begin what's called the nuclear arms race. We have 1, you have 2, we have 3, you have 4, ours is bigger, no, ours is bigger, well, ours is better, well, ours is better, we can deliver ours better, and away it goes, and pretty soon we have enough weapons capable of destroying the world. In 1950, there's a fear that is spreading across the United States that the Soviet influence is going to come to the United States, and this guy, Joseph McCarthy, seizes on it. Joseph McCarthy is the junior senator from Wisconsin. He's running for re-election. And on February 9th, Joseph McCarthy issues these wild accusations that FDR's New Deal Democrats and the entire Truman administration is soft on communism and has even infiltrated the United States government with communists. And that begins a witch hunt known as McCarthyism, in which anyone that Joe McCarthy decides is a communist, and they will be blackballed, and they will not be able to work, and they will lose their jobs, and they will be tried, so to speak, on public television, because TV is new, so we will see the McCarthy hearings on public television. By the way, when I use the word tried, I don't mean a formal trial, I mean an investigation and hearings, but they were tried in the court of public opinion. In April of 1950, we get NSC 68. That's National Security Council 68. And National Security Council 68 is the NSC wild card. Basically what NSC 68 says is the United States can do whatever it wants to, whenever it can, to enact its containment policy. And that means assassinations, it means overthrows, it means military operations done secretly to try to stop the spread of communism. Unrelated to NSC 68, in June of 1950, we have North Korea invading South Korea, and the Korean War begins, and that war will go on for 3 years. And the 38th parallel, which had divided North Korea and South Korea, the northern part of Korea was dominated by communist influences from China. China had liberated Northern Korea in World War II, and the United States had liberated Southern Korea. And essentially a one nation divided, two government scenario has been going on. Well, North Korea wants to unify, so it invades South Korea and the war begins. In December of 1950, NATO appoints General Dwight Eisenhower to be its supreme commander in Europe. He had been the supreme commander of the Allied armies, so now he is the supreme commander of NATO in Europe, and this is all before he becomes president. And then we have a bit of a sidebar, almost a sideshow, with the Alger Hiss story. Alger Hiss had been in the State Department under Franklin Roosevelt. And he was accused of Whittaker Chambers, as part of the McCarthy era nonsense, of being a communist. That he'd been a secret communist, and of course Hiss denied it. And we have this whole investigation, and behind one of the houses there's this pumpkin patch, and in this pumpkin patch there's supposed to be microfilm, and Hiss said he didn't know anybody that was in the Communist Party, and it turned out that wasn't necessarily true, but that he wasn't a communist. Anyway, so on the front of the newspapers there's a headline, Hiss accused of being a communist. Well, it takes a while, and then the newspapers say, Hiss found guilty. But he was found guilty of perjury about who his friends were. He was not found guilty of being a communist. Nevertheless, it's a red scare again, because we believe that there are communists under every rock. Kill a commie for mommy is a popular statement of the day. Connected to that, in 1951, we have the Rosenberg Spy Case, in which Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are convicted of selling atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. And ultimately, they're going to be sent to the electric chair in 1953. The funny thing about this is, there are many people who think that they were innocent, and this was like Sacco and Vanzetti. There was evidence that Julius was a sympathizer, but a sympathizer does not mean you're selling atomic secrets. And Ethel was guilty by association, as historians have generally much formed an opinion about. In 1952, we get the first meeting of the North Atlantic Council, or NATO as we know it, and also in 1952, the United States explodes its hydrogen bomb, which is supposed to be superior and much more deadly than the atomic bomb. In 1953, we get a bit of a respite, because we get the death of Joseph Stalin. And the Soviet Union is effectively without a leader for a couple of years. We also get the end of the Korean War, but the funny thing about the Korean War, it ends right where it began, at the 38th parallel. And to this day, we have a state of ceasefire, because there's never been a peace treaty, which is why the United States maintains a standing army in South Korea. A state of war still exists between the two nations, except they're not shooting at each other. And every once in a while, the head of North Korea, moves the saber around a little bit and says, well, we're going to do this, and we're going to attack you, and the United States says, we're not going to let that happen. And it continues. In 1953, we also have the Soviet Union exploding its hydrogen bomb, and this is an example, once again, of the arms race continuing. Now, if you know where Iran is, Iran bordered the Soviet Union. And Iran had a democratically elected prime minister. Well, the United States wanted a leader of Iran who was going to be faithful and loyal to the United States. In essence, a puppet. And as part of NSC 68, the United States and Britain together organized a coup d'etat in 1953 and oust the democratically elected leader of Iran and install the Shah of Iran, who is going to be a brutal dictator in much the same way Joseph Stalin was in the Soviet Union, except he's going to be our brutal dictator. So we're going to support him for a long time, until 1979, when the Iranian Revolution occurs, and we realize that was really a bad idea. 1954 to 1956. In May of 1954, the Soviet Union unveils its first long-range bomber. So now they can bring their atomic bombs to American soil. And in response to that, the Communist Party is outlawed in the United States, and Eisenhower signs the Communist Control Act, which says if you're a communist, you have to register. So you have to sign a paper stating you're a communist in the United States in the 1950s and register with the United States government. And if you don't, it is a felony and you're going to go to jail. You can just imagine how many people actually did that. In 1955, we get the Soviets' answer to NATO. We get the Warsaw Pact. And if you take a look, who's part of the Warsaw Pact? Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union. This is a gang of nations who are forced to be together. The Soviet Union says, so, you want our help and our protection? Sign here. And they have no choice. In 1956, we have Khrushchev firmly in power in the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev gives a speech to the Politburo in which he denounces Joseph Stalin and the policies of Stalin, which is interesting because Stalin set off a lot of the early Cold War stuff. Anyway, Khrushchev says we can exist peacefully with the West, with the capitalists, and he announces a doctrine of peaceful coexistence. And we enter a time period where we're not threatening each other as much. But now the Soviet Union and the United States are going to enter into a technological race. In 1957, in October, Soviet Union launches Sputnik. Sputnik is the first satellite to orbit the Earth. And of course, the reaction in the United States is now that they have satellites in space, they're going to drop atomic bombs on us. And they had beaten us into space. So the reaction by the United States is the National Defense Act, or the NDEA, the National Defense and Education Act, in which we're going to ramp up our education system, and math and science are going to be paramount as we find ways to combat the Soviet Union on the technological stage. In 1958, we launch our first satellite, the Explorer 1, and by itself, in 1958, the Soviet Union suspends atmospheric nuclear testing. This is that easing of tensions that Khrushchev was talking about, peaceful coexistence. And seemingly nothing to do with the Soviet Union. In 1959, we have Fidel Castro coming to power. The thing is, though, is he's going to be supported by the Soviets. Also, in September of 1939, the Soviet Union actually sends something to the moon. They simply crash an object on the moon to prove that they have the ability to get there. And once again, it is showing Soviet superiority in space in the technological race, and the United States is not going to take that for long. In 1960, we have a big embarrassment for the Eisenhower administration. Gary Powers is flying a U-2 over the Soviet Union, taking pictures and spying. Well, the Soviet Union shoots it down. And the Eisenhower administration claims that we would never do anything like that. We would never spy on you. And Khrushchev says, yeah. And they march Gary Powers in front of the cameras for television. And the whole world sees, indeed, we did do that. We did send someone to spy on the Soviet Union. In November of 1961, we're going to have the changing of the guard in the United States, as John Kennedy will be elected president, and he'll be the youngest elected president of the United States. Also, in 1961, let's go into 1961, the order's a little wrong, I'm going to start at the bottom. In January of 1961, we have Eisenhower refusing to have any kind of diplomatic relations with Fidel Castro. We have a break in that situation in which the United States is going to enter a long period of time in which we're not going to deal with Cuba whatsoever. On January 17th, 1961, Eisenhower gives his farewell address. And in his farewell address, he warns against the close relationship between the military and industry in the United States, because the military needs industry to create its weapons of war, and the industry likes the military as a great consumer of whatever weapons it can produce. It's a customer, let's face it. And he warns against the military-industrial complex. And boy, is he right. In April, switching the order around up there, in April of 1961, the Soviets put their first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. And once again, they have bested us in the space race. But John Kennedy is going to change all of that. In 1961, in April of 1961, we're going to get the Bay of Pigs. And the Bay of Pigs is a failed invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles who've been trained by the CIA as part of NSC 68. And it fails miserably as the Cuban Defense Forces are waiting for these Cuban exiles on the beach and mow them down and arrest them as well. And Kennedy takes full responsibility for the disaster. Following up on John Kennedy's promise to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade, on May 5th, we put our first guy in space, and that's Alan Shepard. He makes a suborbital flight aboard Mercury spacecraft. There were several programs. The Mercury series was to put a man in space. The Gemini series was to improve the technology orbiting the Earth and ready us for a potential moon program, and the Apollo program is what ultimately is the program that puts us on the moon. In August of 1961, we get the Berlin Wall. Khrushchev wanted to make Berlin a free city in the United States. Said no, because it was controlled wholly by East Germany. They wanted East Germany to unify with the other sectors of Germany that had previously unified to a one united Germany. And Khrushchev says no. As a matter of fact, his response, because so many Easterners are fleeing to the western part of Germany, his response is to erect the Berlin Wall. And basically the United States does nothing. And as a result of that, Khrushchev feels empowered and he resumes atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. So what happens? So do we in September of 1961. Things are heating up very interestingly in terms of the technology race. And it looks again like things are going to get busy. Now we move into 1962. John Glenn becomes the first American to orbit the Earth, so now we have matched the Soviet Union. But also in 1962, we're going to have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the closest the United States and the Soviet Union ever come to all-out war, and a nuclear war at that. And what happens there is, as a result of the Bay of Pigs, because people often say, how'd this occur? Remember, we tried to overthrow Castro. As a result of the Bay of Pigs, Castro has reached out to the Soviet Union for protection from the United States, because you're either our friend or their friend. And Khrushchev responds by saying, we will protect you, we will have economic relations with you, and by the way, can we put missiles in your country? And Castro says, sure. After all, the United States has missiles in Europe pointed right at the Soviet Union, so Khrushchev wanted missiles pointed right at the United States. And that leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States finds out about these missiles. It goes on for 13 days, and John Kennedy gets on TV and pretty much says, if the Soviets do not pull the missiles out of Cuba, there will be nuclear war. And he announces a blockade of all Soviet ships carrying weapons into Cuba. Well, the Soviet Union backs down, much to everybody's surprise, and John Kennedy has his win on the world stage in terms of international diplomacy, because when the Soviet Union backed down, we had avoided war. There was one American killed in one of the U-2 flights over Cuba in terms of trying to take pictures and watch what's going on in the development of the weapons. But we essentially get out of it relatively unscathed, and that was a big win for John Kennedy. Khrushchev agrees to take the missiles out of Cuba, and in a secret deal, we agreed to take missiles out of Turkey that are pointed at the Soviet Union. Strangely enough, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev and Kennedy had no direct way of communicating. They did it through emissaries and backdoor channels and ambassadors and secret communications. So in 1963, it's agreed there's going to be a hotline. It's a red phone that connects the United States to the Soviet Union. So one of the leaders can pick up the phone and call the other one and speak to them directly. And in November of 1963, John Kennedy is assassinated. And the rumors about what actually occurred in his assassination are rampant. Some people think it was even the CIA as a result of not going to war against the Soviet Union. Some people think it's white supremacists as a result of him supporting Martin Luther King. The question goes on and on and on. Now we go to 1964 to 1968, and the United States is going to be pretty much heavily involved in Vietnam, but in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev is removed. So about a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, both leaders of the two nations are gone. We're going to be heavily involved in the Vietnam War as a result of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964, and we're going to build our troop force way up, and we're not going to have so many direct altercations with the Soviet Union. Vietnam is called a surrogate war. The North Vietnamese are using Soviet weapons against the South Vietnamese who are using American weapons. And that's what a surrogate war is. It's an ideological conflict between the communists and the capitalists in which a third party, third nation is used to demonstrate the technology, believing that whichever side wins, it'll show the superiority of communism or capitalism.
In 1969, Richard Nixon announces a policy of Vietnamization after a horrible time. In 1968, the year that everything went wrong in the United States, and that was the year of the Tet Offensive, Martin Luther King assassinated, Robert Kennedy assassinated, the My Lai massacre, and Lyndon Johnson deciding not to run for re-election. The United States is stunned like a boxer in the 11th round of a fight he's not doing too well in. Either case, so Nixon announces the policy of Vietnamization, which is basically turning the Vietnam War over to the Vietnamese. It has mixed results because what we quickly find out is they're not really interested in fighting. In November of 1969, we get the Strategic Arms Limitations talks, which is going to lead to an agreement signed by Brezhnev and Nixon, which placed limits on submarine launch in intercontinental ballistic missiles. So this is a bit of thawing once again in relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. And on the heels of that, in 1970, we get the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which basically says that there be no new nuclear weapons being put into the game, being used in the Cold War. In 1970, we also launched the first NATO communication satellite, so the countries of NATO can communicate. And nothing to do with the Soviet Union, but maybe to bring the Soviet Union's ire here. In 1971, we have something called ping-pong diplomacy, which is an opening of relations with the People's Republic of China, with Maoist China, where the United States and Maoist China play ping pong. The first thing that happens is that the Chinese invite an American ping pong team to go to China and play ping pong, and they do. This is the Forrest Gump scene, if you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump. And we also turn around and we invite their ping pong team here to play ping pong shortly thereafter, and they beat our butts pretty badly. But now we're talking. Even though it's ping pong, now we're talking. So Mao asks Nixon if he wants to visit China. And Nixon goes to China in 1972. And what's interesting is Nixon had been a devout Cold Warrior going all the way back to his days as vice president to Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. So this is a guy who would have stomped out communism if he could under his foot. Now he's going to visit China. It really shows a change in thinking. Plus what it also does, it really angers the Soviet Union because China borders the Soviet Union, and the last thing that the Soviet Union wants is China having good relations with the United States. Well, the Vietnam War continues to roll along, and finally, in 1973, we get what's called the Paris Peace Accords, and the United States signs a treaty with North Vietnam to bring the Vietnam War to a close, called the Paris Peace Treaty. Established a ceasefire and a 60-day window for the United States to withdraw all of its troops, and we do that. Unfortunately, what happens is, in 1975, the North re-engages the South in a war, invades Saigon. The United States has to retreat with whatever troops we have left in Saigon to support the embassy, and we look very much like we have lost the war in Vietnam. 1974 to 1983. Well, now we have Jerry Ford as president as a result of the whole Watergate affair. And Jerry Ford is not going to be a strong president, a very good man, but not a strong president. Nevertheless, we're going to have further agreements. If you take a look, we have the idea of limiting USSR strategic nuclear arms. Strategic weapons are weapons of first strike. They are offensive weapons. So we're going to limit those to an extent. Also, in 1979, in December of 1979, the Soviets are going to invade Afghanistan. And they're going to invade Afghanistan, if you take a look, they're going to stay all the way until 1989. And they're going to learn what we should have learned, is that winning a war in Afghanistan is very tough. Charlie Wilson, a congressman from Texas, is going to get involved heavily at using the National Security Council and using his ability to appropriate money for secret operations. He's going to launch what later on is called Charlie Wilson's War, in which we are going to support the Mujahideen, who are the Afghan rebels, as they are fighting the Soviets. So we support, this is another surrogate war, we support the Afghans who were fighting the Soviets during the 1980s, and we basically drive the Soviets crazy. And they're going to lose and have to withdraw in 1989, the same year that the Berlin Wall comes down. Taking a look at 1981, we get the INF Treaty. President Reagan announces new arms control initiatives. It's called the International Nuclear Freeze and Strategic Arms Reductions, the START Treaty. And those occur in the early 1980s under Ronald Reagan. In November of 1981, we get open negotiations in Geneva with the Soviet Union to further limit nuclear forces. 1982 is a relatively calm year. 1983, Ronald Reagan announces the Strategic Defense Initiative. And that is a space-based initiative in which he believes that we can ring the world with satellites. And that those satellites can shoot down incoming missiles from the Soviet Union. And the funny thing about SDI was a child of Ronald Reagan's imagination. He'd never spoken about it with anybody. And he announced it, and physicists in the United States are going, yeah, really? We're going to be able to do that? They had no idea. But nevertheless, it didn't matter whether we could do it or not. What mattered was whether we thought we could do it and whether the Soviet Union thought we could do it, because now that really changes the game. If we can shoot down anything coming from the Soviet Union, we have effectively eliminated their ability to wage war against the United States. And that is a big card to play. The reality of it was it didn't work. It didn't work, and it was a huge, I don't know if it was a bluff, but I'll call it that, a huge bluff by Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan wasn't a physicist. He didn't know whether this would work or not. But we allocate a huge amount of money to it, and we start spending as much as we possibly can on this, and the Soviet Union is not going to be able to keep up. If you take a look at March 23rd, Reagan announced a comprehensive research program, and that's all about SDI. In 1985, after Konstantin Chernenko and Yuri Andropov have come and gone as leaders of the Soviet Union because they keep bringing old leaders, and old leaders don't live long. Anyway, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev is a good guy. He realizes that the Soviet Union cannot win this Cold War against the United States. And he also realizes that the Soviet Union's economy is in tatters. So he comes up with these two new terms, glasnost and perestroika. Perestroika, glasnost. And those two terms allow for greater openness and greater freedom in the Soviet Union. So we start to have businesses privately owned in the Soviet Union, and we start to have greater political discussion in the Soviet Union. Well, it's like letting a tiger out of the cage, because he's going to have difficulty controlling that as time goes on. On March 12th, in 1985, the United States and the USSR begin new arms control negotiations in Geneva, and Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev become what are called fast friends. They're not alike at all, but they both realize that this Cold War cannot be won, and they start negotiating. And in the United States, there are people who wanted Mikhail Gorbachev to actually run for president. Of course, he couldn't. But there was this tremendous thaw, like an ice cube in the sun, of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. The school that I was teaching in at the time, in Washingtonville, New York, even sent students to the Soviet Union to live for a period of time in Moscow with American families. It wasn't a long period of time, but the fact of that actually occurring was an incredible thing. So this was a good time in Soviet-American relations. In 1986, we have returned to the old days for just a while. The Chernobyl power plant explodes in Europe, and the Soviet Union does not fess up about it. And a radioactive cloud spreads across Europe for a period of time, and the Soviet Union says nothing about it, and we're left to find out about it through weather satellites detecting the radiation. In October of 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan get together again at Reykjavik, Iceland, and have another summit. These guys are getting together all the time, and it's a good thing. It's a very good thing. 1987 to 1988. In June of 1987, Ronald Reagan stands by the Brandenburg Gates, which is a major symbol in Germany, by the Berlin Wall at the time, and he gives this famous "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall" speech. Well, it just sounded like Reagan being Reagan. Reagan liked these big speeches and he liked this rhetoric. No one thought it was actually going to happen. Very interesting. It certainly is going to happen. December 8th, well, we have Gorbachev and Reagan. They're together again. Another 3-day summit talking about limiting nuclear weapons. On December 9th, it's announced that they've reached an agreement on doing just that. And December 10th, at the end of the 3-day summit in Washington, Reagan and Gorbachev pledged deep cuts in strategic arms. So this is going really well. This is going really well. Gorbachev is saving a lot of money because they can scale back their program, and Ronald Reagan looks like he's tearing down all of the barriers to ending the Cold War. 1988, May 31st, during a 5-day summit meeting in Moscow, Reagan and Gorbachev again exchanged these documents implementing the ratified 1987 INF Treaty and talking about, once again, ending testing on nuclear weapons. So, going very well. This is where Reagan gets credit for ending the Cold War. Really, what ends the Cold War is the Soviet Union is crumbling, and Reagan and Gorbachev are the guys that are there at that time. In 1989, Ronald Reagan is now gone. George Bush is president during what's called the Reagan-Bush era. May 31st, President Bush outlines proposals for promoting free elections in Eastern Europe and dismantling the Berlin Wall. No one thought it was going to happen. I got up November of 1989, and what's happening on TV? The Berlin Wall is coming down. There's all kinds of crazy protests in Eastern Germany, East Berlin, and Gorbachev lets it happen. Lets it happen. He is opening up the Soviet Union. If you see what it says here, Gorbachev renounces the Brezhnev Doctrine, which plans to use Soviet force to protect his interests in Eastern Europe. He does not want to do that anymore. This is a kinder, gentler Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev. Unfortunately, he's not going to be able to keep it. But what a time it was. On December 4th in NATO, there's a NATO summit meeting in Brussels. George Bush briefs NATO on what's going on, and people are pretty much dancing in the streets, talking about this new era of cooperation. December 29th in Poland, this is the whole Lech Walesa time period in Poland, the Polish parliament abolishes the Communist Party and establishes basically an independent Poland called the Republic of Poland, and the Soviet Union does nothing to stop it. That would not have occurred before Mikhail Gorbachev. 1991, the Soviet Union ends. It's an interesting story. In August of 1991, the Soviet Union essentially collapses. Gorbachev is ousted in a coup. In a coup because the hardliners in the Communist Party do not like what's happening. And they send troops into Moscow to take control of Moscow. Well, the newly elected president of Russia turns around and says, no, we're not going to do that. And Boris Yeltsin gets aboard a Russian tank and speaks to the crowd and saying, this is not how we are going to do this. This is not how the new Russia will be born. And basically puts down this hardline rebellion in the Soviet Union. Reinstalls Gorbachev back into power, but Gorbachev is now a beaten man because Gorbachev believed that he was doing what the Soviet people wanted. So he officially resigns as the last premier of the Soviet Union on December 25th. What a Christmas present. And the Soviet Union is effectively dissolved. And Boris Yeltsin becomes the first president of the new Russia, and the former republics become independent nations. And that is largely the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union. So the Cold War goes out with a whimper and not a bang. And Gorbachev is a transitional figure. Now, let's take a look at some key Cold War vocabulary. The Iron Curtain, that was the term used by Winston Churchill to talk about the occupation of Eastern Europe. The Loyalty Review Board, which came out of the McCarran Security Act and NSC 68 philosophy, and required all federal employees in the United States to sign an oath that they are loyal to the United States government. The United Nations, we've got that. When the Truman Doctrine was the aid package to Greece and Turkey, containment was the philosophy that we were going to contain communism wherever it occurs, not let it spread. The Marshall Plan was the continuation of the Truman Doctrine idea, which is really dollar diplomacy. We're going to rebuild Europe and they're not going to be communist. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the countries bordering the North Atlantic that were involved in World War II now have a mutual defense treaty against communism. Brinkmanship was a foreign policy term that the nation that is most willing to go to the brink of nuclear war will win the conflict. The nuclear arms race, we're going to build as many as we can, they're going to build as many as they can. The Red Scare, the infiltration of communists in the United States government and the entertainment industry during the 1950s, fueled by McCarthyism. Peaceful coexistence, coined by Nikita Khrushchev, that the East and the West can get along with each other without shooting. The NDEA, the National Defense and Education Act, enacted by Eisenhower, emphasizing science, math, and technology as a result of Sputnik. And then we're going to get the space race, and John Kennedy's promise to put somebody on the moon, put an American on the moon before the end of the 1960s. The domino theory was a term used about the Vietnam War, that if South Vietnam fell to communism, all the nations around it would also fall to communism. NSC 68 was a secret National Security Council doctrine that said the United States will do whatever it has to stop the spread of communism. And that includes assassinations, coups d'etats, and all kinds of secret programs. McCarthyism, led by Joe McCarthy, it was the witch hunt against communists in the early 1950s, and it ended up to be absolutely false, but it did get McCarthy headlines for a while. Détente was an easing of tension with the Soviet Union in the 1970s, the early 1970s, under Richard Nixon, and SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, the idea of satellites in space to prevent the Soviets from attacking the United States by missiles. There are certainly more terms, but these are some very important key terms during the Cold War. Now, some imagery and some pictures from the Cold War. We have the atomic bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy on the left. They gave them names, 2 different bombs. And on the right, we have the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. Remember, August 6th and August 9th, 1945. This is Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England, coins the term the Iron Curtain speech, led England through World War II. Operation Vittles, and that is one of the candy bombers. This is the response to the Berlin blockade, and it went on for about 11 months, and we flew over top, and we brought in medical supplies and food, and you see the crowd underneath the photograph. The Korean War. This is the 38th parallel for the Korean War, North Korea and South Korea. And the war went on for 3 years, 35,516 Americans died, and we end up pretty much where we started at the 38th parallel. But this was a war not with just Americans, but with a UN peacekeeping force led by the United States. There were many nations involved in the Korean War, sent by the United Nations. One of the fundamental differences between the United Nations and the League of Nations is the United Nations is able to ask member nations for troops. And Korea becomes the first test of it. This is what Sputnik looked like. Sputnik looked no larger than a volleyball, and those are antennas. And it was a communications satellite, but it proved the Soviet Union could put something in space, and that spurs the National Defense and Education Act under Eisenhower. Fidel Castro, 1959, actually was a minor league baseball player in the United States in Chicago. But nevertheless, he leads the Cuban Revolution, and he survives 10 American presidents. As of point of this video, he's still alive. He starts with Eisenhower, then Kennedy, then Johnson, then Nixon, then Ford, then Carter, then Reagan, then Bush, then Clinton, then George Bush, now Barack Obama, and Castro is still there. He's not in power anymore, but you better believe his influence is still dominant in Cuba, as Raul Castro, his brother, is in power at this point in time. That is President Dwight Eisenhower, most famous for his military-industrial complex speech in terms of the Cold War, leader of D-Day, led the United States during the turbulent 1950s with the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, but his military-industrial complex speech was dead on. These four pictures are the leaders of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We have Joe Stalin, upper left. Joe Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, dies in 1981. Then is Konstantin Chernenko and Yuri Andropov. I did not put their pictures because they were really transitional figures. And Mikhail Gorbachev. So 4 Soviet leaders during the Cold War. And this is the array of American presidents during the Cold War. Starting on the left with Harry Truman, then going to Dwight Eisenhower, then going to John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush is the last guy. He turns off the lights. And that pretty much concludes this presentation on the Cold War. Rather a long presentation. As I said, I wanted to stay off camera so I could go through the slides individually and I wouldn't really get in the way on this. Nevertheless, this presentation and some other notes on the Cold War are available on my website in the YouTube folder, and there's a link directly on the website to it. It's Topic 22, the Cold War. So for now, I'm David Bush, and this is Bush History, and have a great day. See you soon.